So we thought it was time for the Discernible Brisbane studio and the Discernible Melbourne studio to connect, and for Matt and I to have a bit of a public chat.
We're going to get back to normal, no QR codes, because everybody has a level of protection that they've selected.
There's plenty of people talking about the surface issues, but not a lot of people talking about the underneath issues. And if you don't talk about the underneath issues, then you end up with people like Dan Andrews changing the state to a way you may not want it to change to, because these people do consider the underneath issues. And I kid you not, people in the Liberal Party as well, they have an agenda to socially engineer the whole shop of Australia the way they want it to go. And I've had enough.
G'day and welcome to episode 51 of The Other Side. I'm Damien Curry. This is the show that brings you the news and views from a classical, liberal, sensible, centre-right perspective, and we try to give a bit of voice to the millions of Australians that are simply not being represented by either major political party at the moment. We might be in a minority, but we are a big minority. We're the people who don't want to be parented and patronised by the nanny state governments. We want to make up our own minds. And at the moment, a lot of us are drowning in a sea of misinformation coming from a governmental and political class that are basing 99% of their decisions not primarily on science or medicine, but on politics and fear of losing their own jobs. And we're also getting a lot of misinformation from a bunch of nutters on social media with lots of opinions, but the analytical skills of a banana. So if you're as confused as we are and looking for sanity, we will try to bring it to you here on The Other Side and cut through the BS being thrown at us from every angle. We come to you a couple of times a week. You can catch us on YouTube and Facebook on the DISCERNABLE platform, also our main platform, that one, as well as all good podcast platforms in audio like Spotify and Apple. And please do share, click, everything you can possibly click, and help us with the game of playing the big tech algorithms. To vax or not to vax? If you vax, what vax should you get? What is herd immunity? Does it matter? Should the vax be made compulsory? What about civil liberties? What about the need to check in? What about the right to privacy? What about Big Brother data collection? Are lockdowns necessary to stop the spread, or are they just to protect politicians from having to face the unavoidable reality of sickness and death on their watch? So many questions, so little trust in our public institutions these days. Is it any wonder that people are feeling a little strung out? The first thing we need to do, folks, I think, is take a bit of a breath and have a bit of a chat, just to catch up on everything that's just been moving so fast lately. So my colleague at Discernible, Matthew Wong, and I were having a talk on the phone about what to do on the shows this week, and then we thought maybe this conversation, the one that we were having then, is what we should be doing. Let's try to help people understand the issues a little better by just having a chat on the show. So, you know, Matt and I have both been at the podcasting and independent media thing now for about a year. We met late last year when we both appeared on David Pello's podcast, Pello Talk, as guests. We struck up a friendship and we decided to start working together from January. At that point, The Other Side went to video and onto Matt's Discernible platform, where his weekly show, The People's Project, and his in-depth interviews and other shows are hosted. We did meet in person once when I briefly visited Melbourne to appear on Matt's show. We had time for a meal and to record one interview, but our planned weekend of meetings and food got canned when Dan Andrews locked down Victoria back in February and Anastasia Palaszczuk shut the border in Queensland, and I had to bolt home real fast or be separated from my kids for 2 weeks. A couple of badly timed attempts for me to get to Melbourne since then have been thwarted by Dan and his team of trusty sycophants. So we thought it was time for the Discernible Brisbane studio and the Discernible Melbourne studio to connect, and for Matt and I to have a bit of a public chat. So hello, Mr. Wong. How are you, sir?
Did you just say the reasoning skills of a banana? That was a great one.
I did. Yeah. Bananas are not known to reason very well. It's maybe indicative of just how crazy this is driving all of us. Let's just talk about the marches first, because I think that's pretty critical. Just explain to us what you've seen in terms of the video. I know you've put the video together, but there might be some viewers who haven't had a chance to look at it all yet. But Matt's put all the video up last night of all the major incidents and all the video that we have received from the protests that were held in Brisbane, Melbourne and Sydney. So Matt, just give us a little overview of some of the nastier bits.
You can see this on our youtube.com/discernible. Last night we put out a video with criminal solicitor Samir Bunga, just having a look at the size of the protest, the horse punch, someone punched a police horse, or did they? And just looking at what police, how they behaved, what you can do legally, how fines work, how COVID contracts work. So that was a good show last night. But basically the point of it is, of course, the media, I want to say misreported, but I'm starting to understand now that we work in media why it can seem like they're misreporting. Sometimes they willfully skew things, but other times they only have airtime for this much. And so you can't show every piece of footage like we did last night. So, of course, they label it as simply as possible. It was an anti-vaxxer protest. It was a bunch of crazy loons, and it's their fault that Sydney is staying in lockdown. It's lazy, but it's easy.
Well, I can tell you from being a TV reporter in the past that it really is about just brevity, having to make things. And one of the things that frustrated me about TV news and why I got out of the business and started working with people on the other side to help them get their point across was because I saw every single day things being not represented quite accurately through nobody's sort of deliberate intention, although sometimes, yes, there's definitely a bias in the media towards attracting an audience and sensationalizing things, but there's not necessarily a bias to one side of a debate or the other always. There often is, but not always. I used to say to my clients on the PR side that the media play God. It's God, generalization, omission, and distortion.
That's
right,
true.
Or generalization and omission leading to distortion. So it's just the very nature of the fact that it has to be brief, and that's our fault as an audience because we don't have the attention span to take it all in. We don't like watching detailed news too much, or at least the media don't think we do. But you have to generalize things, so you're taking facts, stuff you're seeing, and having to just kind of paint it with a broad brush, and then you have to leave stuff out. And by it's what you leave out that also slants a story just as much as what you put in. But you have to leave stuff out, so you've got to make those sorts of decisions. And then that leads to distortion, but also you might also put a little bit of a distorted angle on things to sensationalize aspects of the story a little bit better. So you're only going to see the 20 seconds of the protest where people were acting like lunatics. You're only going to see the 4 people that were acting like lunatics. You're not going to get a balanced overview or summary of how everybody behaved at the whole protest throughout the day, even though 99.9% of people didn't do anything wrong, and the protest probably for most of the time was peaceful.
Well, I'd say in Melbourne, maybe 90, they were really good, 99%. Sydney, I'd say 90%. There were some dodgy people in Sydney. But hey, politicians do rely on this God thing, generalization, omission, and distortion, because Dan Andrews today got up and tried to say, I don't even know why they're protesting. What they're doing is they're trying to obfuscate and misdirect and make it look like a rabble. We all know there's only one reason why the people in Melbourne were protesting today.
We're not cuddling up to these people. And frankly, seriously, I'm making a serious point. I don't know what half of them were protesting against.
You.
Well,
A lot of them.
then, well, good on them. Except it's illegal, it's unsafe, it's selfish, and it puts at risk the hard work that millions of other Victorians are doing. And it's simply wrong. And if calling it out for the appalling behaviour that it is offends them, tough. They'll need to get over that.
Right, so what they're doing is illegal. And that opens up a whole Pandora's box of questions about, what's prohibited and what's actually morally illegal. I obviously support the notion that people should be allowed to go out and express their opinion and express their views. We've been highly critical of Dan Andrews in the past about the things that he's done, including and most prominently the arrest at home of the pregnant young woman in front of her children, which was an absolute low point in my opinion for Australia as a free, liberal, democratic nation. It was nothing short of utterly disgusting behaviour by a
But what if
government.
they're endangering all of us, Damien? It's for the greater good.
Yes, well, this is the moral question. Are they endangering all of us? And this is the thing that is very, very, I've been trying to sort of work out today, and I want to talk to later, speak about a little bit about later. But I think just before we get off the march, mate, it was quite a diverse group, don't you think?
Yeah, if you look at the footage we put in the clip out last night, there's a lot of young people, which is surprising. And there is a lot of women, a lot. There's also, especially in Sydney, there's a mix. There's a lot of working class in Sydney, which makes sense. You know, they're desperate, they're under a lot of pain, so there's a lot of that. But yeah, I think it's cast as the anti-vax crazy, but we are seeing a big mainstream contingent turnout. And keep in mind, you know, I run a decent sized platform, and others around me, I'd ask what's the feel. It's probably somewhere between 10 and 100 people. I know that's a broad range, but 10 and 100 people who didn't go, but share the same views as the people there marching for freedom, but they didn't go down there.
Yeah, I think so. I think that if you're going to always going to have a certain group of people in any protest group that are extreme. You may have multiple different extreme groups that are quite polarized. I mean, you might have extreme, far left and far right in a protest like this, because you're talking about something like liberty. Then you're going to have a whole lot of pretty reasonable people who are passionate and engaged, good, smart citizens who are turning up just to have their say. And then you're going to have a whole bunch of people who don't like going to protests, who are going to be sitting at home quietly thinking, bravo. And then you'll have an old bunch of other people at home watching, looking at it saying, these people are out of control, or I don't like that, but I sort of support what they're doing. And I think that is a fairly decent proportion of our population. I mean, it's somewhere between sort of 10 and 30% at least at the moment. I would say it seems like about 30% of people are anti-lockdown. I'm getting that feeling. But anti-lockdown, of course, it doesn't mean anti-vax. COVID vaccine hesitant doesn't mean anti-vax. It's actually quite sane to be moderately hesitant at this point. But we are seeing, and you're right, politicians do play on this, but you do see that in television news, the narrative is simplified, or in all news, actually. It's something else that you need to watch when you consume the media. How is this story being cast? Okay, who's the hero and who's the villain? Because all good stories have a hero and a villain. So who's the hero in the story? Who's the villain in the story? And what are they doing in terms of what they're showing me, what they're editing, how they're shooting it, how they're voicing it over, the tone of voice that they're using, the bits that they're leaving out, all of that stuff. How are they influencing that in order to paint one group as the hero and one group as the villain? And is that an accurate representation of reality?
Do you know anyone who went to the protest in Brisbane?
Yes.
Okay, so because I know some who went here in Melbourne. Tell me what type of people they are that went. Describe them.
I'd say very intelligent, sensible, politically conservative, social conservatives. So they're the only ones that I know of that went. I don't know. I haven't spoken to too many people about who went along.
And the ones that you're talking about, where would they stand on vaccines?
They'd probably be just regular vaccine hesitant, sort of, cautious about the risks, wondering whether they should, which vaccine to get and all of that sort of stuff based on all the information that we're being swamped with. I don't think they would be, I would describe them as extreme anti-vaxxers. And the people I do know who are anti-vax, I have, I don't agree with the anti-vaxxers, but I have respect for their right to feel the way they feel and believe whatever they want to believe. And I do think that I've seen that on both sides of the political spectrum. So,
Okay. Well, I know 7 people who went to the Melbourne protests, and I spoke to some of them today. Without fail, they are entirely mainstream people who haven't protested before. They have mainstream jobs. You're going to work with them. Some of them are fine with the vax. Most of them want to wait or don't want to get it. They all are that age group of like 25 to 40. They all are professional. Like you see them, they'll be wearing like a suit type look in the shops. They're more professional than the average. They're all on higher incomes. This is a very mainstream type person I'm talking about.
Well, in a sense, that's good to hear. And do you think, is their position mainly anti-lockdown, or are they anti-vax? Were they civil liberties people, or are they more concerned about what you're saying? They're quite centrist and sane. They're not believing conspiracy theory type people.
No. I'd say 6 of those 7 would be not really into protests, and they're not going down to like push a particular scream, end the lockdown or anything. They just feel like such movement has happened in our Australian context in terms of, they wouldn't even call it civil liberties. They just say, my country is changing for the worse. I'm seeing people yell at each other in the supermarket. I'm seeing family members scream at one another. That's not what I'm standing for. So I'm going down to demonstrate that there is another part of the Australian mainstream, and that's us. So they're going down for kind of like a mainstream issue. They're not going down as a rabid climate change activist or anything like that.
Yeah, and these were big protests too, right? I mean, they weren't small.
Oh, huge.
So
you want numbers?
That's actually a great sign, and I guess it brings us to the point, of why we wanted to do this, Matt, which is that maybe we all just need to take a breath and relax a little bit, because maybe we're being shown the extremes, right? And we're not seeing this, that there's a lot of sort of very sane people in the middle that are quite concerned.
Well, this is the point, right? If you tried to paint these 7 people I talked about, you could maybe paint one of them, but the other 6, you would be impossible to paint as the villain in that narrative that you brought up earlier. It's impossible. Yeah. And it doesn't make good news to show, the manager of Coles, well, they're more professional than that. The local psychologist who works in the clinic down in wherever, it's impossible to paint that person as crazy. So that's why they don't show it. They show the crazies.
Yeah. Well, it's more sensational. Now, as you said, some people would use this for political gain, and I think we did see that happen. It's a very similar way that the left-leaning media and the Democrats in the United States played the January 6 riots in the Capitol, likening it to 9/11, which is utterly absurd. It was a horrible incident. It's a terrible thing that people can storm the Capitol building like that, and that there could have been any kind of security breach. There were, not nice things that happened, but it was generally a pretty lame, apart from the very sad one incident that occurred. In a lot of sense, it was pretty tame and humorous to some extent. It certainly, I don't think, was worthy of being the kind of hysteria that surrounded that. But you always get these extremes at the pointy end, and to dismiss it out of hand, and this is the risk, right? It's something that I think that the left do all the time, or centrists do all the time to a certain extent as well. You just dismiss the idea that these people are representative of anything, and lump them into crazy right-wing nutjob turf, right? Conspiracy theory lunatics, not realizing that that's just the edge of the wedge, right? That behind that you've got, obviously this is a representation of something, greater concerns that are more sensible. And I think our politicians in Australia, in the major parties, and particularly in the Liberal Party, because the Liberal Party is the natural party that should be promoting freedom and liberty and the economy.
Not anymore, mate. Not anymore.
And they're not anymore. I think they're misreading it badly.
Yep.
And I do think that there is a serious level of concern among a whole tier of people who are not crazy. As I say, I think it sits around 30%. It's definitely not the majority, but it's a big enough slice of, I think I said it in the show last week, it's a big enough slice of the Liberal Party's voter base for that party to start to really need to sit down and think. And we've seen, lots of things occurring with John Ruddock, who was a Liberal Party strategist in New South Wales. We talked about that on the show last week. He's out there now joining the Liberal Democratic Party. The Liberal Democratic Party is going to be more resurgent as this sort of centrist, libertarian, light, sort of classical Liberal Party. That's going to be a big threat to the Liberal Party, I think. And we saw Campbell Newman, resigning from the Liberal Party, and there's talk that he might go to the Liberal Democratic Party and run for the Senate.
Yeah.
Right. Who else is out there going to do stuff? I
think there are more names coming too. Yep.
I think there are more names coming too, and I think it's probably a bit of a bit of a shake-up that's probably needed in the Australian political landscape, because there is this large group of people that are not represented, right?
Hey, Damo, you know what's interesting? I spoke to a Liberal politician after the protests. They were concerned about, what does this mean? We can see the mood changing. So we're having some discussions, giving them my thoughts. Happy to do it for Labor as well, but they won't even return my emails. The thing that they said, I'll say they, so I won't give away a gender. The thing that they said to me was they're scared as a Liberal Party to pivot and start to stand as the champion for this disenfranchised, that 30% you talked about, because their base is old. Their base donate to the party. They're all grandmas sitting at home, and they tell me from internal polling, their base is scared out of their minds over COVID. And so that's why you see people like Michael O'Brien coming out with, we should have ankle bracelets. We should do even more fines than Dan Andrews is doing, just outdoing the Labor Party on the lockdown authoritarian line. So they're scared.
There's no question that the Liberal Party polling, I believe, or any polling at the moment, would show that the majority are terrified. And I guess if you're a major party, you've got to get 50 plus 1, right? You've got to get that 51% to win government, or sometimes more than that, depending on how things pan out. So I totally get why mainstream pollies and mainstream parties are completely freaked out right now, particularly in the Liberal Party. It is really hard for them. But I think there are times where you do have to take a stand. You have to go back to your party's core values, and you have to say, well, if we don't stand for this, we don't stand for anything. And I've, as you know, as I've expressed my view on the show previously, I think Queensland and Western Australian state elections were the lesson there for the Liberal Party, and that they haven't learnt those lessons. And I don't know what the game is. I mean, what is the point of going out there and losing again? And of course, another political force is going to start to emerge. Of course, Conservatives within the Liberal Party are going to start looking at One Nation and Clive Palmer, and of course, the classical Liberals are going to start looking at the LDP, the Liberal Democrats, as viable options. And if you get a party like the LDP, for example, that is going to attract more and more high quality talent and emerge as a force. So that then you're going to lose people to them, just as we've seen play out in Australian politics through history, I guess.
So why don't we extrapolate ahead what's going to happen then, right? Because you've got the Labor Party, I think, could really clean up right now. They could, because the Liberal Party are doing a terrible job. The Labor Party could come in on state and fed. I know they're in power in most of the states, but they could swing to capture that aspirational middle class, which they're kind of leaving behind for the champagne socialists, right? But what's going to happen when you've got half of the Liberal Party abandoning it, or not quite half, going to the LDP? That's going to grab that centre mainstream that we talked about. And then they're going to take a more classical fight up to the Labor Party, right? So the Labor Party, I'm just thinking this out loud now. I don't actually have my thoughts gathered. But what's the Labor Party going to do to respond to an ascendant LDP, which is the Libertarian Party? What will Labor do?
I don't think the LDP is necessarily a big threat to the Labor Party. I mean, they're obviously going to move the public dialogue, I guess, over to talking more about the liberal issues that the Liberal Party can't talk about, I guess. And Campbell Newman was on Sky News this week saying that he's going to absolutely, in fact, let's just have a look at a little bit of that. This is from the Chris Kenny show on Sky News. Campbell Newman saying he's going to be holding the government's feet to the fire. And he's now got a platform to do that, even though he hasn't decided where he's going to be or what party he's going to be in or where he's going to do it from, or he's not even in the Senate yet, but he's going to have a political platform. He's going to have a voice somewhere. He's freed up from the Liberal Party restrictions. So we can expect more comments like this one.
I've reached the end of the road with the Liberal Party and the LNP in Queensland because they're not standing up for the values of the party. They're not actually standing up for what I consider to be fundamental Australian values. And when you get to that point, to continue any longer would be false. I just can't keep going in the party. And I want to see change. I want to see real leadership in Australia. And that's why I'm considering running for the Senate as well.
We'll come back to that in a moment, but you've been very critical of the way the coalition parties have managed the pandemic. You're critical of state border closures, of extended lockdowns, of the fiscal, the debt that's being piled up. Now, I agree these are big issues worthy of debate, but hasn't this country handled the pandemic probably as well as any country on the planet?
It's great to be an island, Chris, and that gives you huge advantages in terms of how to seal things off. I actually take a contrarian view to many commentators that I think it's been badly handled. We have dragged our feet. The problem, for example, in New South Wales right now is due to a problem in the processes and systems of quarantine. And similarly, we saw that in Victoria. We need a plan here, Chris. And the Prime Minister should give us that plan. And the plan should be something like this. It should be by date X, late this year, we will have vaccine available for anybody who wants it. We'll give everyone the opportunity to have that free vaccine and their top-up shots. And from that date, we're going to open up. We're going to open up the borders. We're going to have no more lockdowns. We're going to get back to normal, no QR codes, because everybody has a level of protection that they've selected. If you get sick, well, there are health consequences potentially. But we have to go forward because what's been going on, Chris, is we are seeing enormous collateral damage. Children whose schooling at very young ages, I imagine being an 8 or 9-year-old, having a year and a half of your schooling totally disrupted. The mental health problems, particularly for people who've been locked up, those that have had their business and livelihood smashed.
These are big issues, and we talk about them on this program a lot. Shouldn't you be having this argument inside the LNP, inside the coalition, to try and push change?
Well, I didn't really want to get into this, but just a very quick snapshot. I'd say to those loyal men and women in the Liberal Party and the LNP, I tried. I was happy to accept a nomination to the executive of the party by our former president. Sadly, every MP in the room at federal and state level were against me being there. And after that happened, I thought, well, what's the point? These guys aren't going to listen. They probably feel I'm a threat to them because I will challenge them. And I'll challenge the way they've failed in so many ways. And so really I had no other choice to do what I'm doing. But can I just go back to values? These are my values. These are the values of my parents. It's about free speech, freedom and liberty, support for small business, support for resilience and self-sufficiency. My mother was a social security minister. She talked that she wanted a safety net and not a hammock. We should be supporting small business far more strongly. There are many things we could do to make this the entrepreneurial nation of the world if we wanted to.
Now you are going to be
this thing where it's big business, big government and big deficit.
Okay, that's Campbell Newman there, appearing on Sky News' Chris Kenny show just after announcing his resignation from the Liberal National Party in the state of Queensland. I don't know, Matt, in answer to your question about Labor. I think that the Conservative side of politics and the Liberal side of politics, I think we're very lucky at the moment that the Labor Party is not in great shape. They have the Greens problem. They've lost their ideological focus as well. So there's some benefit there, but they trounced the election in Western Australia. They won the state election in Queensland. If the narrative doesn't move on to how are we going to deal with COVID long term, and we don't start to shift the story away from nobody's allowed to die, nobody's allowed to get sick, which is completely unsustainable, unfortunately. We have to open up the country. We have to open up our borders. And even if we just stayed locked down for 10 years, eventually you've got to start moving again. And there might be another pandemic. Viruses are going to be there. It's going to come in at some stage. Now, I think we're already seeing it, of course, in New South Wales. So my concern, Matt, is that we are going to get very, very reactive action from the government. in all governments, of whether Liberal or Labor-led, as the numbers creep up, because there are going to be more deaths and there are going to be more cases, and we're going to get to that sort of level. There's going to be a very, very harsh response.
Yep. Also, then there'll be a push
happen.
so the vaccine passports and mandatory vax, all that's going to get pushed as well. But
yes, and there'll be massive lockdowns.
Massive lockdowns, yeah.
And I think it's the lockdowns more than the forced vaccine stuff that is going to drive people to get very, very angry.
But that's only going to pump up.
Angry.
That'll pump up the tires of the LDP, and they're the only people who can really take an argument to Labor, because the instinct of a Labor person is to fix things, to make a government boondoggle and fix it, create a new strike force, whatever. Whereas the LDP are actively philosophically opposed to that. Whereas Liberals basically Labor light, right? So I think we're about to see actual political warfare start to happen for the first time since, Beasley days.
Well, I think it's going to get ugly. I think there's going to be, there will be violence in the streets, or violence around the toilet paper section of the supermarket amplified. I think we're going to see a lot more of this play out, which brings me back to this question of, how should we be handling this as people? Should we just keep our cool? If you see somebody not wearing a mask and you support mask wearing, how about you just don't say anything, right?
You're supposed to call Crime Stoppers. They keep asking us to dob people in.
Well, I know. And that's just, again, going to polarize. I mean, the police are loving this, right? They've never had so much power, and it's not that they relish power, but police like to police things. I mean, their worldview. People are drawn to policing because their worldview is the enforcement of control, and they do great work. And I'm no disrespect to the police when they're enforcing the law and sensible laws, but it's their tendency to lean towards that and to like control. So not signing in. If you see somebody not signing in, just let it go. Don't play policewoman or policeman on your moral high horse, because it is going to, I think, start to lead to assaults happening, physical assaults occurring.
Between
so
who?
Don't be the police, basically.
Yeah, okay. It's just that your argument's weak compared to theirs, because their argument is your grandmother might die if you allow this kind of behavior to continue. The lockdown will continue because of these idiots. That's their argument. And so people are acting out of fear and a sense of nobility by dobbing people in and having a go at them in the supermarket. And then here comes along Damien Curry saying, liberty's important. Freedoms are... I agree with you, obviously. I'm mocking you for effect. But this is what we sound like to them. We sound like just libertarian nutjobs.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing, and the other reason why I think we have to kind of take a breath, because I think the more angry that you get, if it is a 30-70% split, the more angry the 30% get, the more extreme the top 1% of really crazies get. In a sense, it gives more ammunition to the other side to be pointing the finger and saying, well, you're behaving ridiculously, or your views are extreme. I mean, I wear a mask. Okay, I've got no problem with masks. Masks will bring down the reproduction factor. So it's the reproduction factor, the R0 or whatever, the R0.
You do realise that there are some people who
or something.
Yeah, but you realise that we're hearing more and more from just as qualified experts. I've just had a specialist here with qualifications in biostatistics and public health. He's an obstetrician here in Melbourne. He's saying that his community of experts are saying that mask wearing is going to be seen like bloodletting in the future, maybe 10 plus years away, but he thinks that's what it'll be seen as, because we're trying to defeat an aerosol virus with a mask. Well,
you can't defeat anything with a mask. You could only reduce risk a bit, right? So, if I sneeze without a mask, without covering my mouth, then that's going to transmit a higher level of virus or bacteria than if I've got a mask on. I mean, that's
that's what they're arguing against. They're saying that because it's aerosol now, not on droplets. If it was a droplet transmission, which is what we thought back in the day, remember 2020, and was sterilizing surfaces and all that.
Yeah.
But now, if it's aerosol based, we've got stuff coming out of the US saying you can increase your viral load of COVID by sitting in a room with someone, whether you got a mask or not, because it's aerosol. So over time, you fill the air with a viral load, increases your chance of contracting SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19.
Yep.
So that's mask or not. So anyway, look, we don't need to argue about masks. The point is to accept one narrative and to censor all others. That's never a good way to go about this. And at the moment, there are some legitimate people calling into question vaccines and masks.
Okay.
Let me give you one, right?
We need access to the information, unfettered access to the information, and the ability to make up our own minds as individuals. And I think we have to draw the line at me being able to force you to surrender your desire to not wear a mask. I think that's wrong. I think I can choose to wear a mask if I want to, and I think that you should be allowed to choose not to wear a mask if you want to. And I think we've got to have respect for the fact that the science is complex, it's not settled, and this is where people have so much problem. It's always one extreme or the other. I see so many comments, Matt, on Twitter and Facebook saying, masks don't work, proof, because, or the vaccine doesn't work because you can still get COVID or you can still transmit COVID. No one said the vaccine is going to stop COVID 100% or stop the
Joe
transmission.
Biden did. Joe Biden said it.
Oh, well, Joe
ago.
Biden would, he did the other night, didn't he?
Yeah. Yeah.
Bit of a tragedy, that one. But yeah, I mean, that's sort of nonsense. It is nonsense. And all of this is about taking measures that cumulatively might reduce risk. And I think you should be able to choose what measures you want to take. If you want to stay home for 6 months and not go outside the house and wear a mask, and hey, it's up to you. If you are happy to go outside, you should be able to. Now, the question becomes, to what extent do we have a social obligation to one another? And that's kind of what we've been trying to look at now. Now, the doctor that you were talking to on the People's Project, Matt, and he was saying that a lot of people that come to him are actually quite responsible, quite sane people. They're not.
He's talking about his patients.
Yeah. We'll just have a little listen to some of that from your interview.
My faith has been restored in people by being a clinician who speaks to normal people every day about their genuine health concerns. And I think some of these polls and some of this sort of clickbait hysteria that you see is not reflected in 9 out of 10 people I would chat to. And I'm a clinician who sees people across my desk and talks to them about their health. Obviously, I'm an obstetrician, so they're concerned about their children and their unborn baby. And that's a very interesting survey, but I think people are rightly concerned, but somewhat pragmatic.
What do you think they're accurately estimating their risk of COVID?
I think young people are. And I also don't think they're trivialising it. I think the whole selfish young people wanting to let it rip and sacrifice the elderly is a complete fallacy. I think young people consider pretty much everything I've said. And by young, I'm saying 20 to 50, that sort of age group. Okay. I think people see this as a problem, are very concerned that the draconian, very strict lockdown policy has hung around so long without really an end in sight. I mean, I know they're talking about vaccines and that 4-stage plan to get back to normal, but there's no real date on any of that stuff. And there's certainly some issues around access and vaccine hesitancy that are still to be seen. So I would... does that answer your question?
Yeah. So if you're saying your patients are, roughly speaking, in that 20 to 50 age-year-old group, estimating their risk semi-accurately, not as bad as what we're being told, then they must be really pissed that we're leaving behind this kind of measured approach and we're going into these hard lockdowns. That must explain why the anger in the community is rising.
I think the anger is also more that you cannot question it. You cannot even have a rational debate.
That was Dr. Tom Cade. He is a good guy, and he's been very, I think, quite rational in talking about some of these big names around the world from Harvard and Oxford, and who are not coming out really strongly one way or the other. They're just saying, why can't we speak?
Yeah. So, Matt, have you had the vaccine?
No, I'm 35. I'm not even sure if I'm allowed to get it.
Oh, okay, because you're so young. Yes, I keep forgetting that. You mongrel. So, yes, well, I'm old, and I've had the first Pfizer. I did look at the information. I looked at
you're not
all sides.
dead yet. You're supposed to
and
die.
I'm fine. Yes, I'm fine. Doesn't mean that it's not got its risks, but I'm fine. Apparently, I felt nothing, actually. After the second dose of Pfizer, apparently the symptoms
That's when you die.
are worse. With AstraZeneca, it's the first dose you might feel a bit sicker, and the second one you don't feel so bad. With Pfizer, it's the other way around. So I'm hoping that I won't feel too bad after the second one, and that this is a good sign. But I decided to move ahead just because I weighed up. I looked at all the information. I listened to everybody that I knew that had a counterpoint of view, as I tend to do. I do this show, so I'm exposed to a lot of stuff. And I made that decision for myself. You are going to wait for different technology, or what's your view?
Well, why do I have to get it? Why should I get it?
Why should you get the vaccine?
Yeah. I'm asking because...
There is only one reason that you have to get the vaccine.
Which is?
And that's very questionable. And that is the question of herd immunity, whether it's going to protect other people, which is, the point that we were just talking about, right?
So this makes it really sticky, doesn't it? Because now you're appealing to... It doesn't matter about your bodily autonomy. It doesn't matter about your personal choice. What matters is the tribe. And, to be honest, this is a broader momentum, this move towards tribe, towards the group over the individual. And
it's the momentum that we, as classical liberals and libertarians, at least as I describe the myself and the audience of the other side, it's the very issue for us. I mean, the question of at what point do we give up our individual liberties for the benefit of the collective? And for us, it's really, really late. We don't do it really quickly. So herd immunity is a question that, that's the moral question the other side can put, that we have to get to herd immunity so that people that have weak immune systems are going to, be protected by that herd immunity.
And this is
we're going to go to a video in a moment of sort of explain that a little bit better, explain the science of it a little bit better for those of you who like me, need it explained very simply to them. But Matt, just your view, on that point, on that question.
Well, this is the problem. If someone was to ask me, take the vaccine, and I say, why? It's what I ask you. And they say, oh, because the science says you should have it. And I say, oh, does it? Okay, but what about, okay, and we can have a debate, we can have a discussion. And I'm not talking about fringe science. I'm talking about people who are extremely pro-vax, like vaccine creators, saying, don't take this. But people don't do that. They don't have a debate with me on the science. They will say, take it, because what we just talked about, the idea of the group above the individual. And then now we're into a philosophical, into a moral debate, which I cannot win, because the great momentum right now in the world is towards this group over the individual. And there's no way for me to convince someone that sometimes there are risks to the group when you preserve individual agency. And you have to have some kind of sacrifice to the group to preserve some sense of individual agency. Because if you don't, you end up with the CCP, with the Chinese culture. And maybe that's a better culture. We can argue about that. I don't think it is, but that is clearly the way that they think as a population. And I've worked for Japanese companies as well, and I speak some Japanese. They have a similar culture where they will say, look, we have to do it for the greater good, whether it's from the smallest things to the biggest things, whether it's picking up someone's wallet on the subway, they're always thinking about the collective. And so that is not the culture that we've had in the West for so long. We've had a balance that skews a little bit more towards balancing some individual autonomy with the group safety. And now that we're seeing the pendulum swing towards China, the Chinese culture, those like me get left behind. And it started from honestly, the lockdowns. Why is it that every pandemic readiness plan in the world, in the Western world, did not include these kinds of economic destruction stuff? And the only people to follow their own plans was Sweden, and they made their own mistakes, not protecting their elderly, but they generally followed their plan. Everyone else just threw their plans out and followed Wuhan and then Italy. So Wuhan did a crazy lockdown right at the beginning, remember? And then Italy copied, and then the whole world copied. So I haven't moved. The world has moved.
Yep. No, I take your point, and I certainly don't believe in socialism. I think it's pretty clear. I do believe in trying to do the right thing for the collective as much as we possibly can, but I believe in protecting the rights of the individual and standing up for the rights of the individual first, and it should be a very, very last resort that people are making sacrifices for the collective. Now, that might sound harsh, but the reality is that if we do have a culture that's excessively, leaning towards the collective, you have to have policing of that. You have to have implementation of that from a higher power or a higher authority using the threat of violence or violence itself to implement that. And we know that from history, that has been used as an excuse by every political despot, and it ends up in the murder of people by their own governments on a massive scale, as we saw in the 20th century, we seem to have forgotten about. And I think if you've got personality types, and I'm not going to name any individual specific politicians' names, but I think you can draw your own conclusions. But if you have certain personality types, and I seem to see this personality type on the left a lot more than on the right, where you've got this desire and lust for control and power and to control everybody else's behavior, because you know best. You're so self-righteous that you know absolutely best that the right way that everybody should be behaving all the time, and you can write all the rules. When people like that get their hands on that sort of power, it doesn't dissipate. They like to take it and use it. I think it was Thomas Sowell that said there's no shortage of people out there that want to control other people, right? So we have to protect liberty. Liberty is something that we take for granted, don't we?
I have a bigger concern, and that is the censors of today may be your friends, right? But they'll come for you tomorrow. And so this concerns me when, I've got some friends who are campaigning for banning of fructose and things that I think are really quite evil, because the way that big food industry has advertised and manipulated studies to get the population to reject the food that we've always eaten for thousands of years, evolved with, and getting us to eat processed, high profit, high margin foods, which is primarily high fructose corn syrup based and cereal crop based goods. I think it's quite evil. And yet I'm still not willing to ban soft drinks and fructose and processed foods and margarine, because this is, I've had in my medical clinic, my practitioners wanted to ban some of these dodgy things. I said, if the government bans, say margarine, which is an absolute chemical disaster for your body, eat butter or olive oil or whatever. But if you ban margarine today and soft drinks today, tomorrow they're going to come for your steak, or they're going to come for your avocado oil, because avocado oil's got lots of fats in it, or coconut oil, saturated fat, so you can't have coconut oil. I'm just very wary of giving these people power. I think you need to let people make these decisions for themselves, not think
especially around nutrition. I mean, it's an incredibly complex area, and the science doesn't agree. As anybody's explored, changing their diet to a slightly more healthy diet has seen. The authorities had it wrong for a long time, as we've now learned, and they've changed their tune. I mean, it's just so much around that. And that's a great example, Matt, because this is why we have to have respect for our liberty, and why we have to protect our liberty and our freedom to choose, even when there might be a certain group of people saying, oh, but it's for the public good. It's so good. Now, I had a left-wing friend on Facebook this week. It's like, we ought to ban this, and every time she does a rant on Facebook, that she's banning something, right? Stop this, stop that. If I can just stop all these people having, media platforms or talking, and everybody has to think like me, the world will be a better place. And I just see that as a, pretty weird way to look at the world. I mean, you've got to have tolerance. This is what we've got to do in Australia. We've got to have more tolerance for stuff that's not pretty. We have to have more tolerance for people who are obnoxious racists. You've got to have more tolerance for people that are, saying ridiculous and horrible things. We should, talk back to them and put them in their place and loudly say, but I don't want the government making laws to stop people having freedom of speech and freedom of expression, even if what they're saying offends me. And that seems to be this worldview that we've got in Australia, and the shift that we've had towards, well, nobody can die of COVID. If you question liberty or you question any of the measures that the government's putting in place, even question them, then you're a granny killer, And
well, people
scary.
don't realize that a government, if a government can give you everything that you want, it can take everything that you have. And it's beyond, when I say about give people choice, I'm not just talking about from government. So if you look at the US and the nutrition example, they're so fat in the US, it's not funny, right? So people often point to that and say, oh, look what happens when you have a country obsessed with liberty, and then they all make poor choices and they all get fat and have heart disease and screw up our medical system for the rest of us and blah, blah, blah. That's not the case in the US. They are not free to choose nutritionally. From government, yes. Their ingredient list is actually quite broad compared, we ban certain artificial sweeteners here and in Europe that they don't ban in the US. But when it comes to their corporate monopolies and their crony capitalism, my God, are they captured? And so I'm with the left wing on this. I think the corporate capture, the control exerted by big corporations and rich people and rich media over there to get people to eat cereal-based foods is astounding. I keep on bringing up cereal-based foods because you cannot leverage basic foods like butter and cream and milk and chicken and locally grown carrots and broccoli and whatever. You can't leverage that up as much as you can an LCM bar or a Twinkie or a Beyond Meat burger.
That's right. It's exactly. It's calories, right? Cheaper calories. Anyway, without getting into the food thing too much, I did want to have a look at the question of herd immunity. So let's just have a look at this really terrific little educational video that explains how herd immunity works and why it's important.
As more people gain immunity, the number of infected individuals diminishes. This decreases the likelihood that an infected person will transmit the disease to someone susceptible. What happens as this continues? At a certain point, the virus runs out of places to go, and the spread of the virus is under control. Even those who haven't been infected or vaccinated are protected. We have achieved herd immunity. Achieving herd immunity requires the number of immune individuals to reach a certain threshold. So what is that threshold? The herd immunity threshold is calculated based on a number called R0, which refers to the average number of people an infected person spreads the disease to in a completely susceptible population. Using the estimated R0 for a pathogen, we can estimate the number of people who need to become immune for herd immunity to take effect. So the higher the R0, the more people who need to develop immunity to block sustained transmission. Let's take a look at this visually. For a pathogen that spreads very easily or is highly communicable, say one with an R0 of 5, many more individuals need to become immune to reach the herd immunity threshold. For a pathogen that spreads relatively more slowly, one with an R0 of 2, for example, less people need to develop immunity before herd immunity becomes protective. For the COVID-19 pandemic, R0 is approximately 3, and our mathematical model to calculate the herd immunity threshold tells us that theoretically 2/3 of the population would have to become immune in order to slow down and eventually stop the spread of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. In a population of 300 million, for example, 200 million people would need to be immune to reach the herd immunity threshold.
Now, Matt, they're saying that the herd immunity required for COVID is about 80 to 90%, and that when herd immunity is reached...
What do you mean, 80 to 90% vaccinated? What?
80 to 90% of people in the community have the antibodies.
Have the antibodies, okay.
So yeah, vaccinated or plus natural vaccine. So I think, and also I couldn't get a clear number on the R0 for quite reliable sources have put the R0 for Delta between 1.44 and 3, actually 5. So it's hard to know where that R0 is, and as you saw in the clip, the level of vaccination required for herd immunity in the community is an inverse of the 1 minus 1 over the R0. So if the R0 is 3, which I think alpha was, then it was 66%. Now they're saying the R0 is 5, so it's going to be 80%. So I don't know. It's hard to tell. But I think if we get up, we're certainly seeing in the UK, mate, and that's what I wanted to just go to next, is some real numbers. So we've got in the UK, you've got we can show the image here for the number of people, number of new infections in the testing. We can see a big spike happening. And in the last few days, that spike is seriously turning down. So that's going down. It's around about the 50,000s now, down to the 20,000s per day. And then if you flip over and look at the deaths, you can see that big spike in the deaths that happened back in December, January, that matches the big spike in the cases in December, January. We are not seeing that big spike in the deaths now. Now that could be related to primarily the vaccine, or it could be a combination of the vaccine and Delta being less aggressive strain of COVID. The jury seems to be out on that. Some people are saying that Delta is still very seriously a strain or mutation of concern. There are lots and lots of mutations out there beyond Delta. And the other few that they're looking at as variants of concern. The variants of concern are the ones that actually are of concern because of their rate of transmission is very quick, or is quicker, and the severity of illness might be worse. But it doesn't look like Delta's much of a concern if you've got a vaccinated population there. So that's interesting to think about. And I think if people if we do get up to a vaccination level of just 50%, which is I think is where the UK is at now, 50-60%, well, that might be the US, but if we're at a reasonable vaccination level, you will start to see the benefits and effects quite early, I think.
And I'm being told that Delta fatality CFR is much, much lower than Alpha and other variants. So much higher effectivity.
Well,
but much
I would like
lower.
to think so. I hope it is. It's definitely lower in the data, whether that's vaccine related or not. If it's just actually lower, the stuff I've seen has all said that it's lower. But then I saw some other people saying, it's the reason it's a variant of concern is because it's higher, and we're just seeing the benefits of the vaccine.
I'm a bit concerned that no matter what happens, the narrative doesn't change. We've seen people. The mainstream media and politicians absolutely scare people when something is asymptomatic. We've seen them hype up whether something is deadly or not. We keep moving the goalposts from flatten the curve to keep the hospital functioning, and then number of deaths, and then it was number of cases, then it was number of. Now it's Dan Andrews says it's not even number of cases. I'm concerned that we're teaching people to fear an infection regardless of symptoms. And I think we really need to be looking purely at negative outcomes, deaths, sicknesses. And so I'm uncomfortable with this idea of if we get enough people vaccinated, they say, then we won't have as much spread. Well, hang on, what does the spread mean? Because everyone's got the human papilloma, the HPV, right, virus. There are millions of viruses all over our world right now we're being exposed to every day. It's part of our evolution, man. So we can't lead our community down this fearful path. We do need to take educational steps. I get that, and so on. But where are we taking our people into this fearful place where single death is unacceptable? Biological survival is the pinnacle of all efforts at the expense of all else. And I think the way to undo all this is to be a bit more strident than even what you're being. You know, you're playing their game. I'm saying, why are we playing their game of trying to have the stats support that argument and then tick through their goalposts? I think they've missed the point entirely.
Well, because I think that's, in my opinion, that's science. I mean, I want to know that the scientific arguments are there. Obviously, to me, it's very obvious that the vaccines work because the population that is getting sick and dying still is the population that isn't vaccinated, pretty clearly. So that's that, and the rates have gone. The number of people dying is plummeted in vaccinated populations. So for me, that's a bit of a straightforward no-brainer. The question of whether or not you should be forced to have a vaccine is a totally different question for me as a liberal, classical liberal libertarian. I would need to see massive social benefit for that to support that. So you're right not to be vaccinated or not to get a vaccine or to choose which vaccine you want. That's something I would fight to defend.
Yeah, but we're talking about different
I think
things, mate.
Sorry, go on.
We're talking about different things. All I'm saying is, how many deaths do you think there were in Australia in 2019 is the last year that I can find data for. If I said to Australians, how many Australians do you think died that year? They have no idea that 169,000 of us fell off our perch that year. We are so sanitized and removed from death, which is a real shame. That's not the case in my Maori culture in New Zealand and in the South American culture, where death is a part of life that you embrace and you work through and you grieve. Here, we're so allergic to it that any deaths at all is, you can't have it. So I'm trying to go deeper beyond even what you're talking about, specific rates of death. And so I'm saying we as a society have determined that nobody can die. And that is going to lead us...
It's insane. It's utterly, utterly insane to think that way. And you're right. 4,000 deaths from flu and pneumonia, which is how the Department of Health puts the statistics together. 4,000 plus in years 2019, 2017, when we had a bad flu year, and its average is 3,000 anyway in a normal year. So that's a lot of death that is not preventable. That just happens, and a large majority of that occurs in the elderly population. But yes, we have a weird culture where we think we've got to stop anybody from dying and that we've got the power to. That's the other thing. It's the arrogance and the ego of a culture that thinks it has power over life and death if we just... But it plays on that very deep fear and that sense of safety, and it's all those things that the politicians... We were just talking about how scared those politicians are of all that, right?
Okay, well, of that 169,000 that died in 2019 in Australia, the potentially preventable deaths was 28,000. That's the government statistics, 28 of the 169. And so I don't want to have these arguments about the vaccine efficacy rate and so on. Others can have that, but I'm interested in going after the culture behind it. And I'm seeing people lose their internal steel, lose their sense of morality. I'm seeing people give up on their religions, whatever religion that may be. I'm seeing people scared of whatever comes after death, which may be nothing, right? But they're scared of it so much now that they're pushing it all off. And so I'm just seeing a weak, spineless humanity emerge, and that's what I'm concerned about. And I want to see some of that spine come back.
Yeah, or at least just some acceptance, perhaps, that you may not know everything, and you may not be able to force your will upon other people. I find the Karen phenomenon on both the left and the right to be the scariest, and it's the Karen and Kevin phenomenon, I should say.
Kevin.
Sorry, Kev, actually. Maybe we'll call it the Karen and Darren phenomenon. Sorry, Darren. I've got all these friends named Kevin and Darren. This is not good. Guys, we'll just call it the Karen phenomenon. Sorry, Karen. But I mean, that whole thing is this intrusion, this sense of arrogant sense of I know better than you and I have every right to come and tell you what I think, because we get that ego surge, right? You get that big rush of ego. Oh, I'm enforcing the law. I'm being a good citizen. I'm better than you as a person, you foul person with a mask on, or you foul person without a mask on. And that's what I meant before when I said we've got to just stop that garbage and check ourselves on that crazy behaviour and be a little bit more sensible.
Well, behind that,
Sorry, mate, just before we want to take a little clip from Dr. Vinay Prasad. He was speaking to ZDoggMD on his podcast. I know you're not a big fan of ZDogs, Matt, but I think that some of these debates are quite sensible. And it's interesting to hear two doctors talking about political and social and media kinds of effects of medicine as well. This is a very, very interesting clip. Let's have a listen.
And so I think the average middle class, lower class people in this society, working class people, they have the system is choking them. I mean, it's strangling them. It's strangling their wages. And when you do that to a body politic and deprive them of education, upward mobility, you make them pay for aducanumabs and their taxes that just consolidate wealth. There's only so much they can take, and politicians will come by and they will seize upon the desperation and the apathy and the hopelessness, and they will say what they think the culprit is. And the population will have no ability to differentiate that it is really esoteric structural changes in government and regulation that need to be done to fix this problem. Instead, it's so easy to demonize the other or foreigners or immigrants or whatever, boogeyman we want in power. And so I worry that our political system is extremely volatile. In the next 15 years, we could see anything from, a total right-wing fascist to some
communist state
to somebody in the name of progressivism, but actually offers a incredibly illiberal agenda.
Yeah, exactly. As has been offered. Exactly. I on Independence Day, I did a rant in my backyard where I said, this is an interesting thing about the U.S. We're forced by our body politic to think in short terms, in terms of what's the next election. 2 years of any election cycle is spent trying to get reelected. It's all about the special interests and moneyed interests pushing for their own agendas, and that includes the big tech oligopolies, which we've ceded to them, basically, the social media landscape that hyper-stimulates us and hacks our evolutionary drive to hate each other. And we've let them do that for profit without any bigger agenda for social good, which we all might agree on, like, there's some good things we could do. Well, then maybe we should do that. So, but what are the other systems of government in the world that are currently active? You have the autocrats in China and you have the Putins. Do you think they don't have incentives to think long-term? They do. They have no disincentive to think long-term, and they have control of their population. They have control of the companies, and they can do whatever they want. So do we want them to then control narratives because they are more in a position to do that? They're more in a position to manipulate us through our own systems that were designed with good intent. So who are we as a people? Is it time we woke up to government 3.0?
All right, so that was ZDogg speaking to Dr. Vinay Prasad on his on ZDoggMD's podcast. We'll put the link in the show notes. Matt, I strongly disagree with the idea that we need a central government to sort of dole out better rules and regulations, which I think was part of what they were saying there. I do fully agree with the notion that we don't want to have, the crazy far left or the crazy far right telling us how we have to live and breathe and think. But I think they made a lot of good points about just the nature of things at the moment in terms of how confusing everything gets when there's just so much information out there, and that it's very, very hard to sift through it if we don't have these kinds of conversations.
Yeah, and good on them for saying that. I think they're describing something, as I've been trying to in this interview, something behind all of that, which is a cultural momentum towards what they said, concentrating the discussion and marginalizing and keeping other people out, especially that tends to be the lower socioeconomic classes in society who don't have the same means to have their voice heard. That's really what I've been talking about this whole time behind the vaccine thing. Is I don't like the way that this whole argument is being presented, and I refuse to engage in it, mostly because behind this authoritarian rise, it's going to come for us again when climate change comes back around. That's going to be the next thing, as we heard from CNN's Jake Tapper, whatever his name is. The same arguments we used to have in 2013, like Tony Abbott did this whole no carbon tax thing, right? Can you imagine that today? The whole thing would be like, it's dangerous for the planet. You need to shut down these conspiracy theory misinformations or put warnings on their posts if they speak out against climate change. Those who want to actually go and buy too much meat or whatever, we need to introduce some kind of controls like we do with lockdowns now. All of this becomes much easier to do now than it was in 2013 because our culture is slowly becoming more dependent on an authoritarian state to accomplish what used to be accomplished by culture. And that is my huge concern. We are drifting, and I don't care. Today we're arguing about vaxxers. Tomorrow we're going to be arguing about climate change. Whatever it is, our people are becoming more reliant on the state, more authoritarian. And that, my friends, is why you need to watch the interview I did with Peter Hitchens.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a powerful interview, that one, and I've plugged it a lot. I think it's really an amazing interview, because not just because it's Peter Hitchens, but because it's Peter Hitchens with Matt Wong, and you've asked not to boost your ego too much, mate, but you did ask very probing, very intelligent questions, and it dove very deep, very quickly, and I think he was impressed by that, went with it, and so we've got a piece of you got a piece of viewing there that's pretty unique. So catch that one on the Discernible platform. Matt, thanks very much for joining me on the show this week to have that chat. A bit of a messier format for the other side, and I'm not as good at the casual stuff as you are, obviously, but thanks very much for coming on and having that chat, mate. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Damo.
What do you got coming up on the People's Project on Friday?
People's Project, we're going to have a return. I'm hoping to have Josh back on, and we're going to try and look at what I've been talking about, the cultural movement of things. There's plenty of people talking about the surface issues, but not a lot of people talking about the underneath issues. And if you don't talk about the underneath issues, then you end up with people like Dan Andrews changing the state to a way you may not want it to change to, because these people do consider the underneath issues. And I kid you not, people in the Liberal Party as well, they have an agenda to socially engineer the whole shop of Australia the way they want it to go, and I've had enough. I'm going to pull the curtain on it as much as possible.
Yeah, well, we've got to. We have to, otherwise our freedom is gone. And I think we've got to just start understanding that. And I think the biggest risk to Australia is the fact that people take freedom for granted. They think that it's the norm because we were born into it for a couple of generations now, and it just we're losing the war generation now. They're passing away, getting old, and there's no memory there in the culture of what it means to not have freedom. And so we don't value it. We just take it for granted until it's gone, and we don't want it to go. Thanks again, Matt. Talk to you soon. Hopefully I'll get to Melbourne one day. And that is it for episode 51 of The Other Side Australia. Make sure to join me on Saturday for episode 52. We're going to be speaking to some people from the Liberal Democratic Party about, strengthening liberalism in Australia. So we'll have a look at that. News just this week, of course, the former Queensland Premier Campbell Newman has quit the Liberal National Party in Queensland. All sorts of speculation he might be looking at a Senate run as an independent, or maybe with a party like the Liberal Democratic Party. Be interesting to see how that plays out. And I think there are more names that are going to be, moving parties, I think, not just to the LDP, but to various parties over the next few weeks or months in the lead up to the next election. So there we go. We'll discuss all of that in episode 52 in a few days. So please join us, and please like, subscribe, and share the show. Remember to send us an email at theothersideaust@gmail.com asking to be added to our VIP WhatsApp group, and I'll send you the link to opt into that. It's not a chat group, just a broadcast group, and we send out the link to each episode for you so you don't miss any of the episodes. Also, subscribe to Discernable, our platform at discernable.io to catch all the other great content, and make sure that you can keep catching it if we start to get censored by big tech, which they haven't done, which is good so far. So far, so good. The People's Project is on there. Matt's interviews are all on there, especially that one with Peter Hitchens. So check out discernable.io. So stay safe, but more importantly, stay free, and we'll catch you again on Saturday. See you then.